Dane, welcome to the RevAmp podcast show. We're happy to have you aboard here today, morning time for me, and looks like evening for you. For those who don't already have the pleasure of knowing you, could you just start perhaps by introducing yourself, your role, and a little bit more about your company?
Yeah, Gideon, thanks for having me. It's great to be here and be a part of the RevAmp podcast. Yeah, my name is Dane, and I am leading the revenue operations effort at Bynder, which is a digital asset management company, or DAM, in the DAM space. And I'm only 6 weeks on the job. So I'm in a unique position where I get to kind of create this revenue operations framework from the ground up and use my previous experience in sales operations and revenue operations to lead that effort.
I understand that right now one of the immediate dynamics of your situation is that you're physically in the US, in Colorado, and your team that you'll be building out will be based in Western Europe. Maybe which country will that be in?
It's in Amsterdam, in the Netherlands. Yeah, so Bynder was born and founded in Amsterdam. It's since grown. We've got offices, across Europe and across the U.S. But yeah, making the transition from Colorado to being an expat in Amsterdam, and this is actually the second time I'll be in Europe. For 3 years, I lived in Brussels, Belgium, with my previous company, and we loved being in Europe, both from a work and personal perspective. And so the family's moving over there again. COVID has, delayed things a little bit. It's not the easiest time to move abroad, but the idea is to be there January 1st and be located with all my colleagues there in Amsterdam.
Fantastic. So you're already immersing yourself in that whole process. Tell me, where do you start with building out your RevOps team and program?
Yeah, so I think it's really important to understand the purpose of why RevOps. What does it mean? What does it do, et cetera? And there's lots of great frameworks out there. There's lots of great resources out there in the revenue operations community. And you really have to understand the advantages of a revenue operations team and understanding what it means to have revenue operations within an organization. And, Serious Decisions, which is one of those resources, they put it really eloquently. It's increase the efficiency, effectiveness, and business contribution by aligning revenue impacting operations teams. Now, that's a mouthful. There's lots of buzzwords in there. But essentially, it's how do you support the revenue engine the most effective and efficient way possible? How do your sales reps, how do your BDRs, how do your customer success representatives, how do they impact the customer in a meaningful way? How do you increase customer satisfaction? How do you drive more revenue? And how do you do it the most efficient way possible where you're increasing profitability? And really that's the key, that's the purpose. It's not about anything other than helping support the revenue engine.
So I imagine that even though the definition of purpose might be crystal clear to yourself, when you are introducing a new team into an existing company, for lack of a better word, politically, you might have other line of business teams, other groups within the organization who might not fully get what this means to them personally, what it means to maybe themselves as leaders, and what it means to the company. So tell me, what's your starting point for dealing with that reality? How do you go about that?
Yeah. Understanding the politics of the organization is really paramount. There's lots of different ways you can implement revenue operations in an organization. You can have it all under one, org structure where you're taking marketing ops from marketing and sales ops from sales and customer success from downstream. Some organizations have business operations included or partner operations, et cetera. But the org chart really doesn't really matter. It's about understanding the players and driving to get alignment across those different stakeholders. And it starts at the top. It starts with executive alignment. You might have a CMO chief marketing officer, a CRO, so chief revenue officer, which would typically have your sales teams, and getting, the buy-in from them that this type of alignment and coalition is going to help them be more successful in their jobs. And then the other thing is to ensure that, the people who are within those teams understand what you're doing. You
Right.
almost, you have to reach across the aisle, so to speak, and break down those barriers. And it's also understanding what's been done previously. I'm
Right.
coming into the organization. There's been bits and pieces here or there, and what you're really trying to do is consolidate all those efforts into one, and really think about the implications and the political implications of what you're trying to do, and not piss anyone off. You don't want to make anyone angry. So you just have
on your
to
first
be
day,
careful.
you got to wait for day 2 at least until you do that.
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
Dane,
You don't want to come in, just completely knocking everything down. You want to, listen and absorb and really understand what's going on before you start really doing anything.
so I got a difficult question for you related to that, because you've done this before. You've done rev operations before this company. Do you
Yep.
feel, as you look backwards to look forwards, that it's about getting those other stakeholders to share your view or your agenda of what sales operations is and what it needs to be within your given company? Or is it about you reaching out to fit in with their priorities and reshaping the narrative so that it makes sense for them, but they still feel like they're leading the agenda and they have ownership? Because that's two different tensions right there. And
Very much. That's
two,
really good thought to have. Are you pushing your agenda, or are you trying to fit within someone else's agenda? And I'll probably take the easy way out and say it's a mixture of both.
mhm,
That you really have to ensure that there are already established goals within the company, and there are revenue targets. There are, other corporate level objectives. There are existing team objectives.
mhm,
So a CMO might have, already an agenda that they've laid out. And so you definitely need to make sure that what you're doing is not in, it's complementary to those. It's not in conflict of what the organization is trying to do.
mhm.
But at the same time, you also need to make sure that you're imparting your knowledge in what's going on and the why it's important to have revenue operations in this framework. And in my example, I'm really lucky. Bynder is a very progressive company.
Mm,
They're very open to change and evolution. The company understands that they're at this inflection point where
mhm.
it's been rapid growth, but they're no longer this small scrappy startup. They
Right.
want to, we want to evolve into this big enterprise company. And in
Mhm.
order to do that, you need to put some of these frameworks in place from a revenue operations perspective. And so they're looking at me to bring that knowledge. So it's gotta be a mixture of both.
So I now even have maybe a even more difficult question for you on the back of that one. So so if you were advising somebody who's building out a RevOps program just like yourself, would you advise them, or the person hiring them, probably at the C level, I guess, or senior management, to give a KPI for success that aligns those different lines of business so that your KPI is also maybe shared, or a portion of your KPIs are shared by maybe the marketing leadership or the CRO leadership or whatever, so you're not speaking two languages, but essentially,
Absolutely.
even if whatever 60% of the KPIs are different, at least there's 4% where it's exactly the same. There's one way of recognizing it. Would you insist on that from the
Yes.
get-go? You would?
Absolutely. That's what drives the alignment. So my previous company and this current company, Bynder, we use the OKR framework, so objective and key results. And the reason I like OKR framework is because at the end of the day, you can have the same objective across multiple teams,
Right.
but the key result of what's going to get your team to that objective can be different. And
Right.
so the objective is what drives that alignment across teams. And actually, within my first 6 weeks, I mean, we've created RevOps Q4 OKRs, and the objective is the same at the corporate level. And I've created with my team the key results that are going to get us there. What are those short-term goals that are going to, help drive that objective? And typically, an objective could be, increase or hit a certain revenue target. Well, what are we going to do to help that happen? And, within the RevOps framework, there's lots of ways that can happen.
Very cool. So you've covered purpose, you've covered politics. Yep. What are the key problems that you might need to call out and recognize and acknowledge? Let's start with acknowledging the problems before we even deal
exactly.
with them.
Yeah, the steps of reform, first you have to admit that you have a problem before you can go fix the problem. And yeah, that's something there too. I'm fortunate that at Bynder, people understand the problem and they want to fix it. But you might be in a situation where people are saying, no, that's not a problem, or, something like that. And I guess that goes back to the politics thing, but you really have to understand what the problem is. And I think the most important thing is don't focus on the symptoms of the problem. You got to get to the underlying problem. I call it rock bottom. Like, where is bottom? When have we hit bottom? What is the underlying thing here that we need to solve for? And then the symptoms will take care of themselves. And so data is often one of those things. You come into an organization, you're at a maturation point in the organization where the data it's all over the place. You have data cleanliness, disjointed data that isn't connected. You have data, one team is reporting one thing and another team's reporting another, and they should match, but they don't, because you're not using the same data sources. And so that's a huge component. Parent-child hierarchies, the tech stack is another huge thing where, that's a problem. Oftentimes people implement tools because they think the tool is going to solve the problem. Well, guess what? The tool has just amplified your problem. In inefficient process, automated just becomes more inefficient. So
it becomes becomes inefficient at scale. That's why we automate
exactly,
it, right?
which is worse. It's just amplified the whole problem. So the tech stack, you have to take a step backwards and really think about, okay, if we're going to implement a certain tool, what are we trying to solve for, and go fix that. So CPQ is a great example of that. People think, oh, we'll just do a CPQ tool. Well, if your product and pricing configurations aren't fully dialed, then having a CPQ automation tool is not really going to help. If you don't have list price, if you don't know what discounting is, if you don't know how you're selling products together, et cetera. So first, you got to go solve the product and pricing problem. Then you could talk about a tool to automate your product and pricing. And so that's something that I'm in the middle of right now. It's fun. I mean, to me, this is exciting. Like, this is where it's interesting. And what's great is at Bynder, the teams that I'm working with, they admit that they have the problem. They admit it, and we're working together to go figure out where is rock bottom, go solve that, and then build up from there.
So it sounds like you recognize the potential. What does that, and the problem is not the be all and end all, because it's outweighed by the potential when you kind of stack them up side by side against each other. How as you're walking into this, how do you recognize the potential within Bynder and everything that goes with that?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's the potential from a tactical perspective, and there's the strategic potential as well. And, you have to think about what you can achieve in both of those areas. And, the framework that is revenue operations, the overall potential is really this full lead to renewal process that's just firing on all cylinders. And you've got the tech stack fully dialed, you've got the data flowing, you've got the reporting and analytics. Like, that's the tactical component to the potential of what's going on. And I see that at Bynder. Even 6 weeks in, I can see kind of the pieces. It's like the Matrix kind of thing. You're like reading the code, you're seeing it, and you're seeing it all kind of come together. You haven't executed any of this yet, by the way. I'm only 6 weeks in, but like, you can see that potential, and that's what motivates you. But more importantly, it's what motivates the team.
Mm-hmm.
because this isn't about one person coming in and doing something. It's about the team coming together and seeing the potential together and going, ooh, let's go do that. Let's go solve that. And then that's the tactical side. The strategic side, the potential with the strategic side is having those strategic conversations, not just with management, but also your sales leaders, your sales reps, and getting them to see the potential of what can happen with a strong revenue operations function. Because again, we go back to the purpose. The purpose is to support those teams. And having them understand that potential and that strategic guidance that you can have. How do we go? Enterprise B2B sales is really hard to be a sales rep. I mean, it is not easy. People say, oh, you know, sales, like it's one of the hardest jobs out there. And so by being that strategic sparring partner, you know, to work together and think about how do we break into accounts? How do we, you know, get that internal champion? How do we make the legal process, you know, redlining process easier? How do we, you know, you could just go on, and those types of conversations are really exciting. And you know, the world is endless when you start talking about strategy, in addition to tactics.
You know what strikes me as I heard you speaking there about potential is that deferred potential, which is the sales leaders saw it a year ago, they saw it 2 years ago, the ideas were sounded out, you know, at meetings and such, but action wasn't taken because there wasn't a RevOps team or RevOps leadership structure in place, ends up having a negative or adverse effect by potential which is not realized for an extended period of time, becomes frustration, becomes almost resentment. It becomes the opposite of every good thing, because people then, when you come in and everything has already been spoken about before but nothing has been delivered, people are jaded. So I imagine from a top-down leadership point of view, there's a need to bring in that RevOps function sooner rather than later, and to know that now is the time to realize the potential and not 6 months from now, et cetera, et cetera.
And it's the compounding concept too. You know, if you take care of the problem, if you put in that framework now and you clean things up, you're compounding success instead of compounding complications.
Right.
You know, when you think about your Salesforce instance, the sooner you can put in Salesforce governance into the place, into your organization, the better it's going to be, you know, in the long term. And it makes it, just think about onboarding a new sales rep. If your Salesforce instance is all over the place, onboarding becomes a challenge because, oh no, you have to click over here, you have to fill out this field, you know, but if you've got the flow dialed, onboarding becomes easier. And that's just one small example of where that compounding effect, sooner you can do it, the better. And also, again, that's just the tactical, the strategic. The sooner you can bring in a strategic RevOps mind, you can spar with your CRO, your CMO, et cetera, of, you know, what's the next hire we're going to do? When is the right time to put in a BDR team? When is the next time to have a renewals or strategic account management? You can have those kinds of conversations. You can test things out. You can theorize, et cetera. And then again, it compounds on itself. So yeah, the potential's all there. The sooner you can bring in someone, definitely the better.
So aside from speaking to yourself, I've spoken to many sales and revenue operations professionals, you know, many guests within this podcast series that share with me and with us how wide the scope of the role can be. For yourself, as you're taking this on, how do you begin to prioritize?
Yeah, priorities are tough. I think it's twofold. One, you have to think about kind of how do you make an impact, you know, in the short term? What's the quickest path to an ROI for you, for the team? Because that builds momentum, you know. And so maybe it's a data cleanup effort. Maybe it's a new report, you know, a new way to forecast. Oh, you've never done, you know, weighted forecasting. Let's try that. Let's do that type of stuff. So you can look across the, you know, the organization. It could be, you know, impacting commissions, automating, you know, a component. Start with something small and simple, and, you know, do a couple of those and get momentum going, because that will energize you as a
Mm-hmm.
RevOps leader, but it'll also energize your team to see that. And, that again, it compounds it on itself. You've got the energy, you show the ROI. But I think you also need to prioritize a lot of those problems that we talked about earlier. You need to get down to the base root and prioritize the big ticket items that are going to have the most impact for the long term. So right now I've got kind of that 2-year vision, that 2-year roadmap. So I'm thinking about what can I do in Q4 to help us succeed in Q4,
Mm-hmm.
because that's huge. But then should I also be doing in Q4 that's going to help us get to where we need to be at the end of 2022? And so having that dichotomy of a short-term priority versus the long-term priority is really important, because some of these projects, I mean, to implement a new tool, to fix your data, to implement Salesforce governance, whatever the case may be, to change your commission structure, whatever the case may be, it takes a while to execute those things. So you got to start now.
Right. So you were saying that essentially there's a ratio between the now versus the future, and mostly they're overlapping, and you just the ratios of how much time is spent on each in the given quarter, but you can't
Yep.
afford not to think about the future and to defer that and make it that conditional.
Exactly. Because if you're just thinking about now, you're not going to be laying that foundation to really make that long-term impact. So you have to have that that dichotomy of now versus later.
On the flip side, are there any kind of typical false flags that you'll see in revenue operations where people think it is a priority, but really it's not?
Probably all over the place. Yeah. I think what ends up happening is people think it's a priority, but it's really a symptom of the problem.
Right.
It's not the problem itself. And maybe that's where, kind of like what you talked about, you have to work with other people's agendas and everything. Hey, okay, let's go tackle that. You know inherently that that's just a symptom of another underlying problem, but
Mm-hmm.
you can't get to that underlying problem maybe for another 6 to 12 months. So in order to kind of win points, develop relationships, etc., maybe you do have to go a little bit outside and fix a symptom of a problem. But you still need to, that's still progress too, because in the short term, that person's life might be easier, or they might be able to succeed, and then it compounds on itself.
So if I pull this all together, I think what would be interesting now to think about or to hear from you would be what your leadership philosophy is for progression of your team members and how that contributes to the progress of the revenue operations agenda and team overall. So purely from a leadership point of view, how do you build out that team? How do you lead? How do you invest, and how do you weigh that all up? What's your philosophy there?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and it's something that I can't really take credit for. I've had some really great managers and mentors in my career.
Mm-hmm.
One of whom has been on the RevAmp podcast, Jeff Wadham, who's now with MindBody. He was my boss for many years, and I've kind of learned from him, learned from the best, and his philosophy, and I've taken it to heart, is invest in your team, and it'll take care of itself from there.
Mm-hmm.
When you really put the emphasis on growing each of your individual team members and thinking about what they want, the more you can do to support that, the better the whole team is going to be, because that person's going to be happier, especially in the COVID times, burnout's real, etc. So if that person's really engaged and you're imparting your knowledge, but then you're also thinking about what do they want out of this, because some people in their career, they're happy. There are analysts that have been analysts for 20 years and they don't want to become a manager. They just want to stay an individual contributor. And you want to support that. You want to say, okay, how do I make your life easier as an analyst, or in that role where you can see yourself still in that role in 20 years. Then there's other people, myself included, who, hey, I want to be a manager, I want to be a director, I want to keep going. Okay, well then, to go from individual contributor to manager, what do we need to do? Do you become part of other conversations? Do you get involved in different components, etc. And then, there's also the consideration. There are some people, you understand, they're not going to be with the company forever, right?
Hmm.
And but what you're trying to do is help them succeed in their role so that they will do better when they go to a new company. And it's that community feel, right? Like,
Mm,
especially in the RevOps world, where RevOps people go to different companies, but you're still part of that revenue operations community.
right.
They're learning, they're progressing, and you're able to really grow the individual to kind of grow the team
Hmm.
and go from there.
I see that idea and that reality of RevOps community really becoming more and more real, more tangible in recent months, even recent years, and probably has been accelerated by COVID-19 and the fact that we have more time to communicate. You and I
Yep.
might not be doing this meeting in this interview right now. If it were normal times, you might be too busy in Amsterdam eating your pancakes and managing your
Bitterballing.
yeah and managing your your new team. So I'm thankful for the opportunities that come out of it. I was actually thinking to kind of be to test this out, devil's advocate. When you're building a new team, you might hire people that are highly motivated because then you can invest in their progression. When you inherit a team, you might come across team members who are not highly motivated and are completely okay with the status quo, and
Yep.
therefore you're trying to change the internal culture from that of indifference or maintenance modes to that of growth. And I don't think you can disconnect revenue operations from growth, if that's a fair statement, right?
It's definitely a fair statement. Yeah. And I think what I've seen is companies that are investing in revenue operations, they have that change mentality. It is something that kind of goes hand in hand with revenue operations, is that growth set. That growth mindset, like, we need to grow. So we need to put in place this structure. There might be individuals on the team that might not want to play ball, and
Hmm.
you've got to do your best to satisfy them and their needs. Again, going back to the progression, investing in your team, and what do they want out of all of this.
Mm.
But at the same time, those people are probably going to be pushed out anyway, because if you're in a high growth business, change is inevitable. And if you're resistant to change, go work at a huge company that's well established, that's totally mature, and go have that job and that career for 20 years. But I think what we've been seeing in the B2B space that need revenue operations functions, it's that highly dynamic environment. And Bynder is a great example of that. It's very dynamic, we're growing very fast, and the people are excited about that growth and that change.
I can see that. I can see that once you get a group of like-minded RevOps professionals together in one team, in one location, that it probably comes kind of like an endorphin. You probably
Yeah.
trigger on each other's energy, momentum, ideas, hunger, and passion to see growth, to see success. So I imagine that it reminds me of like playing varsity sports or whatever. That sense of being on that journey together and getting a kick out of all of it, which is good because
Yep.
you can't be a ball player all your life. So it's good to see that there's careers just like that that you can enjoy the same highs.
Exactly. Yep. Yep. It feeds on itself. It compounds on itself. And RevOps is a great place to be. There's a great community out there. There's a lot of resources out there, like the RevAmp podcast, but other stuff. And don't feel like you're alone.
Hmm.
You've got a team internal in the organization, but also remember that you've got a team outside the organization. And pretty much anyone that you've had on your podcast and are in LinkedIn or other forums, like, you reach out, they love to talk about revenue operations.
Right.
They love to talk about the journey and the pitfalls and the things to look out for. So that's really exciting to be a part of that community.
I see that many of them are truly ambassadors for the value and importance of revenue operations. You know, obviously we had Rosalind just on the show last week, and I see that you're no exception, that equally you are as passionate as the rest. And unfortunately, in each of these recordings, we have, you know, a link to each of your LinkedIn profiles directly below. So it's not difficult for anybody to find you if they want to reach out directly and ask questions and tune in to all of your experiences. So Dane, to kind of
Yes.
bring it to a close, super thankful that you've given us time today to share your experiences. We are invested in your present future success story over at Bynder. I know these next months will be pivotal and really monumental, and we hope that you'll come back in the future and tell us how that story rolled out. And thank you
Yeah, we
once
could do
again.
part 2, the learnings from the journey.
Absolutely. Dane, thank you so much. Wishing you well from everybody here in the RevAmp team, and look forward to seeing you grow.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.